My name is Margaret Knight. I'm 38 years old, and for most of my adult life, I believe stability was something you built the same way you build infrastructure, deliberately, layer by layer, with no room for error. I work as a civil engineer for a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Munich. My schedule is steady but demanding. Early mornings on site, evenings buried in paperwork, calculations, approvals. It's not glamorous work, but it's precise, reliable. The kind of work where small mistakes turn into expensive failures if you ignore them long enough. I don't ignore small things. I never have. That mindset shaped my life outside of work too. My routines, my finances, my relationships, especially my relationship. My boyfriend, Lucas Reinhardt, is 36. We've been together for 12 years. Not married, but everything else looked the part. Shared apartment, shared expenses, shared habits that had quietly turned into a life. From the outside, we made sense. We owned an apartment near the Isar River. We split the mortgage. No children, but we shared a dog, and most of our finances were intertwined in ways that made us look permanent. For a long time, I would have described us as functional. Not perfect, not passionate in the way movies pretend relationships should be, but stable, predictable. And I liked predictable. Lucas was different from me in ways I used to think balanced us. He worked as a senior account manager for a pharmaceutical sales company. His job involved constant travel, meetings with hospital administrators, conferences, client dinners that stretched late into the night. He was more social, more expressive, more spontaneous. Where I built structure, he moved through it. At least that's how I used to understand us. Looking back now, the shift didn't start with anything dramatic. There was no obvious breaking point, no single moment where everything changed. It was slower than that, subtle, the kind of change you only recognize once it's already taken hold. The first thing I noticed was his phone. Not that he used it more, everyone does, but the way he used it. Angled away from me. Screen dimmed faster than usual. Notifications silenced more often. On its own, that means nothing. People are allowed privacy. What caught my attention wasn't the behavior itself. It was the context. Around the same time, Lucas started treating me differently. Not aggressively. Not even openly disrespectful at first. Just dismissive. Small comments about how I dressed. Little jokes about my routines being predictable. The way he would sigh when I talked about work, like I was explaining something tedious instead of sharing something important. It wasn't explosive. It was erosion. Steady, controlled, almost methodical. And I noticed it because that's what I do. I notice patterns. Around that same period, his travel schedule increased. Conferences in Berlin, training sessions in Frankfurt, client dinners that ran late. On paper, everything checked out. I verified it. That's instinct for me, not paranoia. When he said he was attending a conference, I looked it up. The events existed. The venues were real. The companies hosting them matched his role. There was no obvious lie to point at, so I didn't. I didn't accuse him. I didn't even question him directly, because I didn't have evidence. What I had was a pattern that didn't feel right, and feelings on their own are not data. The real shift, the one I couldn't ignore, wasn't a message or a missed call. It was logistics. I handle multi-million euro infrastructure projects. I manage timelines, budgets, resource allocations. When something doesn't align, it stands out to me the way a crack stands out in reinforced concrete. Lucas's stories started to develop small inconsistencies. Nothing dramatic, just enough to create friction. Expenses that didn't match the trips he described. Restaurant bills for two when he claimed he was dining with larger groups. Hotel charges that didn't align with the conference locations he mentioned. When I asked casually, he would snap, not defensive in a guilty way, annoyed. Like I was inconveniencing him by paying attention. "You're overanalyzing again," he said once, barely looking up from his phone. I remember that moment clearly. Not because of what he said, but because of how easily he dismissed me. That wasn't new. Lucas had always been blunt. He called it honesty. I used to interpret it as stress from his job. Sales targets, travel fatigue, constant pressure. I work with contractors who shout for a living. I'm not fragile about tone. But this felt different. It felt rehearsed, like he needed me to be the problem. One night, he came back from what he said was a cardiology sales summit in Berlin. He looked tired. Not physically, emotionally distant, irritated even, as if my presence in our apartment was an inconvenience. I asked how the event went. He shrugged, dropping his bag by the door. Boring, same faces, same fake networking. The answer was casual. Too casual. Because earlier that week, I had looked up the event schedule. It wasn't a 4-day conference like he told me. It was a 2-day workshop. I didn't confront him. Instead, I leaned against the kitchen counter and said lightly, "Do you still have the program? I might recommend that hotel chain for a project meeting." He didn't even hesitate. He rolled his eyes. "You're being weird, Margaret." Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "I threw it away." That was the moment something settled in my chest. Lucas doesn't throw away work materials. He keeps digital copies of everything. Always has. Suddenly, he had nothing. No brochure, no schedule, no trace, and more importantly, no patience for my questions. His attitude toward me escalated after that. He started comparing me to other men, colleagues' husbands who were apparently more ambitious, more spontaneous, more interesting. He said I was predictable. He said it like it was a flaw. Predictable pays the mortgage. Predictable builds stability. But in his version of things, predictable was something you outgrew, something you tolerated, until something better came along. The way he spoke to me began to feel strategic, not emotional, constructed, like he was building a narrative where I was the dull partner, the one who could be sidelined without consequence. I had seen that behavior before. Contractors do it before terminating partnerships. They create justification, a story that makes the decision feel inevitable. So I stopped asking emotional questions, and I started verifying facts, quietly, carefully, because by then I wasn't trying to understand how he felt. I was trying to understand what he was doing. And somewhere in the middle of that shift, without saying it out loud, I think I already knew. Once I stopped asking Lucas questions, everything became clearer. Not immediately, but steadily. The way things always do when you remove emotion from the equation and let patterns speak for themselves. I didn't confront him again after the Berlin inconsistency. I didn't need to. If he was lying, confronting him without leverage would only teach him how to lie better. So I shifted my approach. Quiet observation, verification, cross-referencing. The same process I use when something doesn't align in a construction plan. You don't assume failure. You test the structure until it reveals where it breaks. The first thing I focused on was our joint credit card. Not obsessively, just methodically. Lucas had started expensing things to it more frequently, charges that his company should have covered. That in itself wasn't unusual. Reimbursements take time. What stood out was the type of expenses. Boutique hotels, not conference venues. Restaurants that billed for 2 people, not groups. Wine selections that didn't match business dinners. At first, each charge could be explained. Individually, they weren't proof of anything. But together, they formed a pattern that didn't match the story he was telling me. When I asked casually, never accusatory, he would react the same way every time. Annoyance. You're micromanaging me again. I deal with clients, Margaret. Not everything is itemized the way you like. You wouldn't understand how this works. That last sentence stayed with me, not because it was true, but because it was dismissive in a way that felt intentional, as if keeping me uninformed was part of the design. So I stopped asking altogether, and I started checking independently. Conference schedules, hotel bookings, public event listings. I even called one venue he claimed to have stayed at, pretending I was organizing an engineering seminar. I asked about corporate room blocks. His company hadn't reserved any. That was the first contradiction that couldn't be smoothed over. Not by tone, not by interpretation, just fact. After that, something in me shifted. Not emotionally, operationally. I moved from suspicion to confirmation. And I still said nothing to Lucas. At home, he continued the same pattern. Dismissive comments, subtle comparisons, a growing distance that felt less like stress and more like disinterest. Sometimes I would watch him across the room while he scrolled through his phone, a faint smile tugging at his mouth, something I hadn't seen directed at me in months. I didn't ask who he was talking to, because by then I already knew the answer would be incomplete. The next opportunity came 2 weeks later. Lucas told me he had a 3-day training in Frankfurt. He mentioned it casually, like it was routine. It should have been. By that point, I had learned not to challenge statements directly. So instead, I adjusted my behavior. "I have a site inspection that morning," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "I can drop you at the airport." He declined immediately. Too quickly. "It's early," he said. "I'll just take a taxi." There was nothing inherently suspicious about that. But it registered. Because of the speed of his answer. Because of the lack of consideration. Because he didn't even pretend to think about it. Still, I said nothing. The next day, after he left, I checked the credit card. No taxi charge. Instead, there was a parking garage fee near Munich Central Station, 5 minutes from my office. I stared at the transaction longer than necessary. Not because it was shocking, but because it was clean. Simple, impossible to reinterpret. He wasn't at the airport, which meant he wasn't in Frankfurt. That realization didn't come with a rush of emotion. No anger, no panic. Just clarity. On the second day of his supposed training, I adjusted my schedule. I told my team I'd be reviewing plans remotely. Around noon, I walked past the parking garage listed on the charge. His car was there, parked exactly where the receipt said it would be. For a moment, I stood across the street watching it, half expecting myself to feel something stronger. But what I felt instead was confirmation. At that point, I still didn't assume an affair. People lie for many reasons. Not all of them involve another person. But he was lying. That much was undeniable. I crossed the street and sat in a cafe with a clear view of the station entrance. I ordered coffee, then another, then water. I didn't check my phone. I didn't call him. I didn't move. I waited. Not because I needed proof anymore, but because I needed to understand the scope. Time passed slowly, almost 3 hours. Long enough for doubt to try and resurface. Long enough for my mind to suggest alternative explanations. Work emergency, unexpected meeting, something I hadn't considered. But then, at exactly 3:07 in the afternoon, Lucas walked out of the station. And he wasn't alone. The woman beside him wasn't unfamiliar in the way strangers are. There was something practiced about the way they moved together. Close, comfortable, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Not tentative, not new, familiar. They weren't colleagues maintaining polite distance. They weren't acquaintances. They were integrated. Like this wasn't the first time. They didn't see me. I stayed seated, still observing, because movement would have broken the moment, and I needed it intact. They crossed the street together, talking quietly, laughing at something I couldn't hear. He opened the passenger door for her. She slid into his car like she had done it before, like she knew exactly where everything was. He walked around to the driver's side, got in, and just like that, they were gone. No ambiguity, no room for interpretation, no missing data. Lucas wasn't in Frankfurt. He wasn't at a training. He wasn't working late. He was meeting her, in my city, during work hours, while telling me he was somewhere else entirely. I didn't follow them. I didn't need to. Instead, I took my phone out slowly, captured a few photos, clear enough to identify both of them, clear enough to confirm the license plate. Then I put my phone down, finished my coffee, and went back to my office. I completed my reports that afternoon the same way I always do. Accurate, on time, no deviations, because that's what I do. I don't collapse under new information. I process it. That night, Lucas came home around 8. He dropped his bag by the door, loosening his tie. Long day, he muttered. I looked up from the kitchen. Frankfurt traffic bad, I asked. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. Terrible. And the hotel food? Don't even ask. I nodded. Asked a few neutral questions. Let him talk. And he did. Easily. Confidently. Without hesitation. That was the moment something settled into place completely. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It required planning, coordination, repetition, and most importantly, confidence that I would never find out. As he spoke, moving around the kitchen like nothing had changed, I realized something else. The way he talked to me, the faint irritation, the subtle dismissal. It wasn't accidental. It was functional. He needed me to feel small, predictable, replaceable, because that made what he was doing easier to justify. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't confront him. I just listened and mentally adjusted the model I had built of our relationship. Because at that point, it was no longer a question of if. It was a question of how long. After that afternoon, I stopped looking for confirmation. I already had it. What I needed next wasn't proof. It was scope. How long? How consistent? How deeply integrated the lie had become. So I continued observing, quietly, precisely, not out of denial, but out of discipline. Over the next few weeks, I mapped everything. Phone records were the easiest place to start. There was one number that appeared consistently, daily, sometimes for short bursts, sometimes for over an hour. Late at night, when Lucas claimed he was reviewing reports. Early in the morning, when he said he was preparing for meetings. The pattern was too regular to ignore. I ran the number through a public registry. It was tied to a small consulting firm in Munich. I searched the firm. There were only a handful of partners listed. One of them was the woman I had seen with him outside the station, his ex-girlfriend. The detail clicked into place with uncomfortable precision. This wasn't new, not entirely. It had history, which meant it likely had roots. That realization didn't hurt in the way I expected. It didn't feel like a sharp break. It felt like something slowly being rewritten in real time. At home, Lucas didn't try to hide his contempt anymore. It became casual. If I asked about dinner, he would sigh like I was interrupting something important. If I suggested we do something together on the weekend, a hike, dinner, anything, he would dismiss it. I need something more stimulating than forests and spreadsheets, Margaret. He said it once while scrolling through his phone, barely glancing at me. I stood there for a moment, processing the sentence. Not the words, the tone, the ease. As if I had become background noise. It wasn't just that he was cheating. It was that he had already repositioned me in his mind, downgraded, redefined. Like I was no longer his partner, just part of the infrastructure he lived inside. One evening, he said it more directly. You've gotten too comfortable, he told me, leaning back on the sofa I paid for. There's no ambition anymore, no spark. I looked around the apartment, the mortgage I had secured before we were even married, the renovations I had funded, the life I had built with intention. Comfortable. The word felt selective, but I didn't argue, because by then I understood something important. This wasn't about truth. It was about narrative. He needed me to be inadequate, because that made what he was doing reasonable. People rarely see themselves as the problem. They rewrite the story until they're justified. By the third month of quiet observation, I had enough data to establish a timeline. The affair had been going on for at least a year. Hotel bookings in Munich under his name, duplicate calendar entries he forgot to delete, gaps in his location history, patterns that overlap too cleanly to be coincidence. At that point, I could have ended it, printed everything, laid it out on the kitchen table, forced a confrontation. But something stopped me. Not fear, clarity. Because what mattered wasn't just what he had done. It was how he would respond when faced with it. That would determine everything. So I chose the moment carefully. One evening, after dinner, while he was still in the living room scrolling through his phone, I walked in and stood across from him. Are you seeing someone else? I asked. No buildup, no accusation. Just the question. He looked up slowly, not startled, not panicked, annoyed. The reaction was immediate and telling. He didn't rush to deny it, didn't try to reassure me. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling like I had just asked him something inconvenient. Even if I was, he said, what would you do about it? There was no hesitation, no guilt, just irritation. Like we were discussing a scheduling conflict. That was the moment the situation changed for me. Not when I saw him with her, not when I confirmed the calls. This moment. Because this wasn't just betrayal. It was entitlement. I held his gaze. I already know, I said calmly. The consulting firm, Munich Central Station, the Frankfurt trip. For the first time, his expression shifted. Not to remorse, to calculation. He sat up slightly, eyes narrowing. You've been tracking me, he asked. I've been paying attention, I replied. There was a pause. Short, measured, then he shrugged. Not defensive, dismissive. You're making this bigger than it is, he said. It's not that serious. A year, not serious. I didn't respond. I let the silence sit between us. He continued, almost impatient now. It's been going on for a while, yes, he admitted, but it doesn't mean anything. That sentence clarified everything. Not because of what it said, but because of what it revealed. He didn't think it mattered. Not in the way I did. Then he added, almost as if explaining something obvious to a child. You're stable, Margaret. You're safe. She's different. Different. Exciting. Unpredictable. He didn't say those words, but they were implied, as if those were categories he was entitled to experience simultaneously, as if I was a baseline, and she was an addition. That was when I made my decision. Not emotionally. Logically, I nodded once. Then I turned and walked to the bedroom. He didn't follow. Didn't ask what I was doing. I pulled a suitcase from the closet, set it on the bed, walked back into the living room, placed it on the floor in front of him. You need to pack, I said. He blinked, actually surprised this time. For what? He asked. To leave. The word hung in the air between us. He stared at me for a second, then laughed. A short, disbelieving sound. You're serious? He said. Yes. That was it. No raised voice. No emotional escalation. Just a boundary. The apartment is in my name, I continued. You can take what you need for a week. We'll arrange the rest later. His expression shifted quickly, from amusement to irritation to anger. This is ridiculous, he snapped, standing up. You're overreacting. I didn't move. You're not staying here tonight, I said. Adults have complicated lives, Margaret, he said, running a hand through his hair. You don't just throw everything away over something like this. Something like this. I repeated the same sentence. You're not staying here tonight. He stared at me, trying to read me, trying to find hesitation. There wasn't any. Because this wasn't a negotiation. Within minutes, his frustration turned into motion. Drawers opening, clothes being pulled out, thrown into the suitcase with unnecessary force. This is insane, he muttered. You're going to regret this. I stood in the doorway, not arguing, not responding, just watching. Because the decision had already been made. He moved faster than I expected. 40 minutes. That's all it took. 40 minutes to dismantle 12 years into a suitcase. When he zipped it shut, the room went quiet. He looked at me one last time. Waiting. For what? I don't know. A reaction. A reversal. Something. He didn't get it. So he picked up the suitcase, walked past me, and left. The door closed behind him with a soft click. No slam. No drama. Just finality. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence. Then I walked to the door, locked it, and changed the access code to the building garage immediately. Because once a boundary is set, you don't leave it open. The first thing I did after Lucas left wasn't emotional. It was administrative. I sat down at the dining table, opened my laptop, and started documenting everything. Dates, times, transactions, screenshots, photos. Not because I wanted revenge, because I wanted clarity. When things move toward legal territory, clarity matters more than feelings. I created a private folder, backed it up twice. Once to an external drive, once to a separate email account that only I had access to. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was preserving a timeline. After that, I moved through the apartment methodically, changed the Wi-Fi password, deactivated his garage access, notified building management that only I was authorized to modify entry permissions. All of it legal, all of it documented. No room for interpretation later. Then I blocked him. Phone first, then messaging apps, then social media, not impulsively. Strategically, because I understood how Lucas operated. When he felt control slipping, he didn't panic. He reframed. He debated. He reshaped the narrative until reality felt negotiable. I wasn't going to give him access to do that. Within an hour of leaving, he had already sent messages. I saw them before blocking him. They moved quickly from anger to condescension. You're acting insecure. Long-term relationships survive worse than this. You're throwing away stability over something physical. That word again. Physical. As if 12 months of deception could be reduced to a category. I blocked him mid-paragraph. Not out of spite. Out of discipline. Because responding would have opened a door I had just closed. After that, I logged into our shared financial accounts. I separated them. Transferred half of the joint savings into his personal account. Left a clear digital trail. No games. No hidden moves. Fair division. I wasn't interested in dragging this into a prolonged fight over money. I changed emergency contacts, updated my insurance beneficiaries, informed my bank of the separation. Each action was small, practical, but together they did something important. They made the decision real. Around midnight, my phone rang. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few seconds later, it rang again. Same number. I checked. It was the consulting firm's office line. I declined it. Blocked that too. Not because I was avoiding the situation, because I was controlling access to it. The next morning he showed up. I saw him through the intercom camera, standing outside the building. Pressed button after button, waiting. Ringing again. I didn't answer. Instead, I opened my laptop and sent a single email from a new address. The only channel he wasn't blocked on. Communication will go through lawyers from now on. Do not come to the apartment without written notice. I kept it short, neutral, no emotion. He responded within minutes. You're being cold. I thought you were more rational than this. The irony didn't escape me. Blocking him wasn't about punishment. It was about preventing revision. He had already demonstrated that he could reshape facts into something softer, something more convenient. I wasn't going to let that happen. For 3 days, there was silence, not acceptance. Recalibration. On the 4th day, the tone changed. The email he sent was structured, organized, almost professional. He wanted to discuss practical matters. The dog, the furniture, mortgage payments. It was the first time he acknowledged the situation without minimizing it. I replied once. Brief. The dog stays with me. My schedule is stable. I am home most evenings. Veterinary records list me as primary contact. No emotion, just facts. As for the apartment, I made it clear I wasn't trying to leave him with nothing. I proposed a financial settlement equal to his documented contributions toward renovations. Nothing beyond that. I attached bank records, transfer histories, clear numbers. His response came quickly, and the edge returned with it. You're punishing me for being honest about my needs. There it was again, reframing. The affair wasn't betrayal, it was expression. He continued. Our relationship had been stagnant for years. You checked out emotionally long before anything physical happened. Physical, again, as if that word carried less weight, as if it minimized everything else. What struck me wasn't the argument itself. It was the absence of accountability. At no point did he say it was wrong, only that it was complicated. He wrote about growth, about how modern relationships weren't always strictly monogamous, about how expectations evolve in professional environments. That last sentence told me everything I needed to know. Not about us, about him. Later that evening, a mutual friend called me. Careful tone, measured words. He said Lucas had told people I overreacted, that I had thrown him out over a short-term mistake. Short-term. I listened, didn't interrupt. Then I sent him 2 screenshots, just timestamps, spanning 12 months. Nothing explicit, no commentary. He went quiet. That was enough. I didn't need to defend myself loudly. Facts carry their own weight. By the end of the week, Lucas shifted again. New strategy. He suggested therapy. Not to reconcile, he said. To process. To understand what went wrong between us. I read the message twice. Then I closed it and didn't respond. Therapy is for problems people want to solve. He had already solved his. By outsourcing what he felt was missing, I had solved mine. By removing him from my home, there was nothing left to process. Only something left to finalize. I filed for divorce the following Monday. No delay. No symbolic waiting period. Just paperwork. My lawyer had already reviewed everything. The apartment ownership, the financial records, the timeline I had documented down to individual transactions. There was no ambiguity, no loose ends. Just a process. Lucas didn't expect that. He called the same day he was served. New number. I let it go to voicemail. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the irritation underneath it. You didn't have to make this hostile, he said. We could have handled this privately. I listened to the message once, then deleted it. We could have handled it privately. If he had handled it privately when he chose to step outside the relationship. That afternoon, he sent another email. Different tone, less defensive, more calculated. The situation with her isn't serious, he wrote. It's already run its course. That was the first time he acknowledged the end of the affair. Not because he felt remorse, because it was no longer useful. He continued. You're dismantling something stable over something temporary. Temporary. A year. I read the message without reacting, then replied once. This isn't about whether she was temporary. It's about the fact that you weren't. After that, I stopped responding entirely. Everything went through my lawyer. No side conversations, no emotional detours. Just process. In the weeks that followed, I adjusted my life the same way I would adjust a project after identifying a structural flaw. Efficiently. I informed my bank, updated my insurance, changed emergency contacts at work, small actions. But each one reinforced the same thing. This wasn't temporary. This was a reconfiguration. Friends began reaching out, some cautiously, some directly. I didn't campaign for support, didn't explain unless asked. And when I did, I kept it factual, no embellishment, no emotional framing. Lucas, on the other hand, continued shaping his version. According to him, I was rigid, unforgiving, incapable of adapting. It was almost clinical. The way he reframed my refusal to tolerate betrayal as a flaw. The irony was precise. Immaturity would have been staying. Negotiating my own boundaries down until they were unrecognizable. 2 weeks into the process, he asked to meet. In person. Not to reconcile, he said. To end things respectfully. I agreed. Not because I needed closure. Because I wanted to hear what accountability sounded like when there was no leverage left. We met at a cafe near his temporary apartment. Public. Neutral. Busy enough to prevent escalation. He arrived 10 minutes late, dressed carefully, like this was a meeting he had prepared for. He sat across from me, composed, measured. I want to acknowledge that I handled things poorly, he began. Not wrong. Poorly. I let him speak. He talked about restlessness, about feeling invisible in our routine, about how my predictability made him feel stagnant. He described the other woman as someone who made him feel energized, seen. Like he wasn't just part of a structured life. I listened, then asked one question. If you felt that way for years, why didn't you leave before starting something else? He hesitated, just for a second, then answered. I didn't want to lose what we built. I waited. He continued. The apartment, the stability, the life. There it was. Clear, unfiltered. I didn't want to give that up, he added. That was the closest he came to honesty. And it was enough, because in that moment, everything aligned. He hadn't seen the affair as a betrayal. He had seen it as an addition, an enhancement, something he believed he could integrate without dismantling the structure I maintained. He looked at me then, carefully. Is there any version of this where we pause the divorce? He asked. Give it 6 months. Reassess. 6 months. As if time would dilute data. People make mistakes, he added. Long-term relationships require flexibility. I held his gaze. This isn't about flexibility, I said. It's about alignment. He leaned back slightly, frustration flickering through his composure. You're acting out of pride, he said. You're punishing me because your ego is bruised. That was the only moment I felt anything close to irritation. Not because of the accusation, because of how predictable it was. Ego would have been exposing you publicly, I said calmly. Contacting your clients, creating consequences outside of this. I paused. What I did was remove you from a property that legally belongs to me and file for divorce through the appropriate channels. He didn't respond, because there was nothing to argue with. That's not pride, I added. That's standards. The conversation ended shortly after that. No raised voices, no dramatic conclusion. Just completion. I stood up first. Told him I wished him clarity in whatever he wanted next, but it wouldn't involve me. He didn't try to stop me. As I walked back to my car, something settled in a way I hadn't expected. Not relief. Not satisfaction. Just resolution. He had expected me to treat a year of deception as a negotiable inconvenience. Something we could absorb. Adjust around. Like a temporary disruption. Instead, I treated it as final data. The divorce moved forward without spectacle. Because everything had been documented early, there was little to contest. He attempted once to negotiate a larger settlement, framing emotional distress as a factor. My lawyer responded with numbers. Documented contributions. Nothing beyond that. The agreement reflected reality, not interpretation. The separation period passed quietly. He moved into a smaller apartment on the other side of the city. From what I heard, indirectly, the relationship with the other woman didn't continue. That part didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how quickly my life stabilized. No tension in the apartment. No undercurrent of irritation. No late-night phone calls taken in another room. No subtle comparisons. Just quiet. The dog adjusted within a week. Routine returned. Not the same as before. Cleaner. A few months after everything finalized, he sent one last email. No anger. No defensiveness. I underestimated how serious you were about your boundaries, he wrote. I thought you would cool down. Reconsider. That line stood out. He believed my standards were negotiable. That pressure would reshape them. That time would soften them. I didn't respond, because there was nothing left to clarify. People have asked me since then if I regret not trying harder to fix it. The answer is simple. No. Repair requires mutual recognition of damage. He never acknowledged harm, only inconvenience. And those are not the same thing. Looking back, the affair itself wasn't the most revealing part. It was the expectation that I would accept it, integrate it, adapt around it. But relationships aren't infrastructure projects. You can't reinforce a foundation while someone is actively drilling into it. I didn't get even. I didn't expose him. I didn't retaliate. I removed access. I enforced boundaries. I followed through. For me, that wasn't revenge. It was consequence.